Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Today, we're going to be talking about PTSD, and we have Family Houston senior clinician Jorge Mendoza with us to discuss what PTSD is, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as how it affects both veterans and civilians. Welcome, Jorge.
Hey, Shelly. Thanks for having me.
So I'm Shelly, the manager of communications with Family Houston. And before I give you guys a little background on Jorge, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, feel free to comment below. Or if you want, you can email us privately at family@familyhouston.org, and we'll have one of our clinicians reach out with an answer for you. So Jorge is a licensed professional counselor with over 5 years of experience providing mental health services in clinical and school settings. So you guys might have seen him around the community doing a bunch of outreach for us. He offers English and Spanish counseling and has a strong focus on trauma, PTSD, and anxiety-related issues. So Jorge, thanks again for joining us. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, not a problem. I'm ripping off the Band-Aid right now, so it's fun.
Yeah, you totally got this. So with 8 million adults suffering from PTSD each year, can you explain exactly what PTSD is and who can suffer from it?
Yeah, so PTSD is a really interesting disorder in that, in the DSM, it's kind of something that now we have the right verbiage to say that this is post-traumatic stress disorder. But historically, we've actually seen it like in fictional writings where people talk about, soldiers returning back from World War I, World War II, and they call it soldier's heart, battle fatigue, and a lot of references to service members because they were just the easiest population to see that were suffering with symptoms of PTSD, but we didn't know exactly what it was necessarily. But it's essentially a disorder of non-recovery from trauma. So when a traumatic event happens, we naturally do have the ability to recover from it. It's just that if we suffer something that is incredibly traumatic or a series of traumatic events, we may not be able to overcome it and we get caught in trauma loops, and that's where the disorder starts to form itself. But research actually shows us that it doesn't really matter if you are a service member in the armed forces or a civilian. It can affect people, regardless of that status. It's just that historically, it was much easier to see in the veteran population. So that's why you see a lot of cultural references, like shell shock and that kind of thing.
Interesting. I hadn't heard of the trauma loop, but that makes sense that you can't quite process it and heal from it, if I'm correct there.
No, yeah, definitely, you're correct. People get caught in trauma loops in that they typically don't want to think about what happened, but they're having repeated intrusive memories of the experience. And that tends to be one of the first symptoms that we see with people with PTSD.
Oh, that must be so tough. So kind of talking about trauma, can you explain what the difference between trauma is and post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you asked this question because, when I first started working in counseling, it was a little hard for me to discern from it just because I think, thankfully, the stigma towards mental health has decreased a lot. So people will talk a lot more openly about, trauma, collective trauma, racial trauma, different things that people endure. And, we're having these open conversations. But then there's a clinical aspect of what is PTSD and then what is trauma. So think of trauma as the event that happens to you. And then PTSD is a mental health disorder that may or may not develop as a result of unprocessed trauma. So, statistically, about 70% of the population may suffer a traumatic event in their lifetime. And that's incredibly high. That's just 30% of the population that, will be fortunate enough to not experience a traumatic event. But, that 70% is people that suffer a traumatic event. It doesn't mean 70% of the populace will develop PTSD. It's a very different thing. So the percentage of people that, will develop PTSD is somewhere around like 3 to 5%. And that's for the American statistics right now. So if we compare that, 70% may experience trauma, but only 3 to 5% may actually develop actual PTSD. So again, trauma is what happened to you, and PTSD is a disorder that may or may not develop.
Wow. So the human body is very resilient. We're definitely we can come back from some of these very traumatic things. What are some examples of traumatic events that can cause PTSD? I know you had mentioned some, like battle or service members, but I imagine there's probably plenty of traumatic events that could cause it.
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little bit more dicey and where you really do want to have, the help of a professional to help you understand what is diagnostically going to fit PTSD, because trauma is trauma. We're not here to criticize or tell people that what happened to you was not overwhelming, was not traumatic. But under the DSM-5, it categorizes trauma as, witnessing or experiencing combat exposure, surviving a life or death experience, surviving sexual abuse, physical abuse, and that's regardless as to whether or not you were an adult or a child when it happened. And also, surviving the threat of violence. So this is really important for people to know because I've had so many people come into my office and they've suffered a traumatic event and they're showing signs of PTSD. And one of the things that comes out of their mouth is, "But nothing happened to me." Like let's take an example of a person, a random example, that maybe they survived a mugging and they never saw the mugger's weapon, but the mugger intimidated them and said, "If you don't give me your purse, if you don't give me your money, I will do XYZ with this weapon." And even though the person, the client may not have seen the weapon, in that moment, you had no idea whether or not this person was actually going to harm or kill you. All you knew in that moment was my life is in extreme danger, so I need to do whatever it takes to survive this situation. So whenever I have people come in and they say, "But I didn't suffer any broken bones. I was physically fine from the experience." That doesn't really matter. The event was so traumatic enough because in that moment, your entire life security was completely shooken up. So we see a lot of people deal with symptoms of, a hard time accepting that something is traumatic for them because they feel a sense of shame of, well, I shouldn't be having these symptoms or these feelings because I was okay. So we work through a lot of that. So like I said, combat exposure, different types of abuse, witnessing life or death situations or experience them as well. If you witness a death, that can also count as trauma. And then actually, this is important for our first responders and our veteran population. If it's part of your job to be kind of in the line of fire or witnessing a lot of life or death scenarios, so think of an EMT, police officers, firefighters, where their job is to walk into dangerous situations because it's part of their job and it's not something that's isolated and it has a repeated chance of happening several times, especially with firefighters. They're summoned when there's a crisis.
Yeah.
They can be much more susceptible to developing PTSD. So that's different as opposed to someone that, maybe you saw something very scary on TV. That necessarily, it may not trigger trauma or PTSD because it was an isolated occurrence. It can shake you up. But unlike a firefighter who's, daily being inundated with threats against their life or seeing other people having to risk their lives or dying, unfortunately, on the job, it's a very different scenario.
I think it's interesting that you point out about firefighters. I think so many times, we associate them with just putting out fires and forget that they're usually the absolute first responder on site. And I imagine they experienced and witnessed some horrifying things that no one should have to see. So I think that's a good point to keep in mind. What are some common symptoms? I know you mentioned one earlier, but if you could talk about some of the other common symptoms someone might experience if they are suffering from PTSD.
Yeah, so going back to the symptoms, I stated previously that one of the first things that we see is people coming in with, the intrusive, repetitive memories of the experience. So, PTSD is it's super interesting, and that's why I like to work with it a lot because, as opposed to an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, when people suffer from PTSD, they don't want to think about what happened. They want to pretend that it never happened to them. They want to get over it. And I hear that frequently all the time of, this happened 3 years ago, 30 years ago. Why can't I move on? I just want to act like it never happened. I'm a brand new person, etc. But they're still being inundated with these repetitive, intrusive thoughts of what happened. And that's part of the trauma loop where people can't stop, the flashbacks, because PTSD is curious in that your mind, in order to cope with trauma, will kind of set up these little alerts in your system where essentially you're on the lookout for anything that could pose a danger to you. So let's say that you survived a mugging again, and it was, in a parking lot or whatever it may be, where now anytime that you're in a large open space, you're going to be triggered with flashbacks of what happened. You're going to have increased hypervigilance. You're going to have increased anxiety. That may also lead to increased irritability or aggressiveness, because if we're automatically seeing people as, oh no, this person's coming and walking in my direction, maybe they're going to try to hurt me, you're going to act more defensively. So we see that aggression, anxiety as well, the hypervigilance, and a lot of negative thoughts about themselves and the world. Because the PTSD will tell you, in order to be safe and to never have to experience this horrible event again, I have to be on alert, but I also have to see the world in a specific lens. So, when we work with survivors of assault, whether it's physical or sexual, sometimes they will make generalizations about groups of people, because if they say, well, this person that assaulted me was of this sex, of this racial background, whatever, the mind cannot discern, oh, wait, no, that just happened to be the assailant, the attacker. It's not the community that hurt me. But the mind is just so focused on let's never, ever be in danger again. So it will make those instantaneous kind of reactions of, oh my gosh, there's a man walking towards me. I must be in danger. He's going to hurt me. And so we see a lot of people have thoughts of, all men will hurt me, or all people of this certain background will try to harm me or do something, as well as the negative thoughts about themselves. So unfortunately, a large majority of people with PTSD will, they'll tell themselves stories. The narrative will change. Well, they will tell themselves, if only I had looked over my shoulder, if only I had not, had that second beer at the bar with my friends, XYZ wouldn't happen. Or if I would have fought back. That's the most heartbreaking to hear from my clients. If only I would have fought back harder, then this wouldn't have happened. And if you look at it on the surface level, it almost makes sense. But the second you peel away that first layer, you see how irrational, because people with PTSD will oftentimes leave out a lot of details of what happened. And it just becomes this attempt to find a way to justify how the event never had to happen. Because, the tragic thing about trauma is that it is unjust. It is unfair. Sometimes it has no rhyme or reason. You could have been doing everything perfectly fine in your life, and then some tragedy befell you, whether it's an accident, whether it's an attack, or any other kind of traumatic event that I mentioned. But we as people, we don't like to hear that, and culturally, we always tell one another, we hear these phrases like, there's a reason this happened. You're going to learn something from this. The universe has a way. And we're trying to justify, that the world is safe. The world is safe, predictable. It's the just world theory, essentially. And it provides us a lot of security. We learn it really when we're kids. So when trauma happens, something that is incredibly unjust, unfair, and unpredictable, it shakes that core value. So the mind will do what it can to reassert that platform of, well, no, there has to be rhyme and reason. So therefore, if I never drink again, if I'm always hypervigilant and looking out constantly, this will never happen again, because that was the reason this happened. But it's completely irrational, and it keeps them again in that trauma loop.
Wow. I can't even imagine having to, come to terms with that, or, someone feeling responsible almost for something that's not their fault and is completely unjust. Like you're saying, that must be incredibly hard for you to see and, want to, tell them like, it's not your fault. It's okay. And you didn't do anything wrong. Is there a time length for how long PTSD lasts, or, when it might begin after an event?
So the thing about PTSD is that diagnostically, the DSM-5 says that we can begin diagnosing 30 days after an event occurred. But what we typically see in the therapy room is that people will wait months, years, sometimes even decades to seek help. And it's not uncommon, because I just realized I forgot to mention one of the most important symptoms is actually avoidance. So again, people with PTSD don't want to talk about what happened. They will do everything possible to ignore the symptoms and the distress of what they're experiencing and what happened to them. So
Right.
Because of that large avoidance, they will be denying that anything is wrong. They will try to internalize all of their issues, oftentimes, even though they're suffering and they really, really do want help. So because of that, we have to remember that we have the avoidance, and then we have the cognitive part, the logic part, that is telling you, no, you have to be on the lookout. You have to identify certain groups of people as dangerous in order to never be in danger again. So when we start working with someone with PTSD, we follow a very structured approach that I'll talk about later on in this conversation, where we have to recognize that we're essentially asking people to not think in the very ways that they think are keeping them safe. So if I tell you, stop doing the very thing that you think is keeping you alive, you're going to be resistant. You're not going to want to do it, even though you don't want to suffer. So because of that, people can spend a long time with PTSD, and without treatment, it can actually last for a very long time. But there's always hope. It is never too late to start the therapy process with a trained trauma professional. As long as you are committed, brave enough, and dedicate the time and effort, then progress and change is possible.
So then I think you just answered my next question, but I'm going to ask if you can maybe dive into it a little deeper. So is there any way to treat PTSD? And from your answer, I'm going to guess that there is hope, and maybe we can talk about kind of what that looks like.
Yeah. So again, in the realm of therapy, there's been many different ways. Whether it's a trauma-based treatment or a PTSD type treatment. So I'll talk about the PTSD level treatment because again, they are a little bit different. So PTSD, we're tackling the diagnosis. You have to meet the criteria for that specific diagnosis of PTSD. And there's two that I'll mention right now. There's cognitive processing therapy, CPT for short, and then this is a mouthful: eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR for short.
Okay. I like
And
the EMDR.
yeah, the EMDR, it's much easier to say. It's a bit of a tongue twister. And I'm actually trained in cognitive processing therapy, but thankfully at Family Houston, we also have two clinicians that are in training to practice EMDR as well. So we offer both CPT and EMDR. For cognitive processing therapy, it kind of says it right there in the title, cognitive. So, and I'm sure you picked that up from the way I was talking about it. We really focused on the thoughts aspects of what's going on. So in my work, we have a structured approach, and CPT will only last from 12 to 16 weeks, and they're weekly sessions. So that's it's very different in that when people think of therapy, they think of, first of all, they always think of an older person. They think of a person with a gray beard and that you're going to be in therapy for decades. And that may or may not be the case. If that's your goal, more power to you. But if you're looking for really targeted treatment where you want to go in and say, you know what, I really just want to focus on this. And then if I decide to do longer term treatment to address other issues, CPT is a great option because in really 3 to 4 months, the program will run its course. And we focus heavily on tackling those cognitions. And we do a lot of homework exercises, a lot of writing exercises to tackle that faulty logic that people have. And we're really tackling the avoidance because, like I said, people don't want to surrender the faulty thoughts. We call them stuck points, actually. They don't want to give up those stuck points because they feel, well, this is what's keeping me safe. But we do it in a very compassionate and structured way where a person begins to explore how rational, how reasonable is this type of thought. And, we've seen the progress happen where, typically around session 7 or 8, a little bit halfway through the program, people have this light bulb moment of, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. It wasn't my fault. And instead of someone telling them, they reach that point themselves where they realize it, because people with any mental health issue, they know it's not their fault, but there's something there where the connection isn't being made. So CPT really allows us the opportunity to tackle that logical aspect, so that they can realize for themselves, there's different ways for me to think about the world where I can understand, oh, the trauma did impact my life. It did change my life, but it did not ruin my life. It did not break me. I'm not dirty. I'm not this, I'm not to blame. And I can actually see the world a little bit differently, but in a healthy mind frame. So that's a little bit about what we do.
For both you and the client when they can come to that.
Yeah, it is. And typically people don't like CPT at the beginning because, again, we're targeting that stuff that they don't want to let go of. But I try my best to also be as likable as possible and assuring them, hey, I will go as far as you want to go. I always respect my clients' needs and beliefs sometimes. And there's some things that they don't want to let go of. Be like, okay. And then they get to it themselves eventually. But they have that moment, that catharsis. And that's where we see the real gradual, symptom reduction, where all of a sudden they're just less scared and they start to break out of that trauma loop. So, and I've worked with people that, they've dealt with something that happened when they were a teenager and now they are in their middle age. I've dealt with people that, it happened within the first year, and it's possible. It's completely possible to grow and change.
I think that's such a wonderful thing that, what you're saying, that there's hope. I mean, and for anyone, it doesn't matter how long ago it happened. It's not too late, that you really can still work through it and, heal from it and, live a healthier, happier life, hopefully.
Yeah.
I don't have any other questions, but I actually have a question from someone who's watching. So this question is, what about traumatic childbirths for implications into persons being predisposed to mental illness in children, adults? So I think the mother was predisposed to depression for a tragic life event, and is wondering about, I guess, the traumatic childbirth.
So if the traumatic childbirth, it's hard to give a solid answer without all the full details. So I'll do my best possible here. But when we suffer a traumatic life or death event, and typically traumatic childbirths will fall into that, because in that moment, You don't know, is my life at risk as the parent who's giving birth, or is my child's life at risk? Then that would definitely qualify. And and I think she was talking a little bit about, what if I was already predisposed, already had a risk factor to being, depressed, whether it's, major depression or postpartum depression, then yeah, it's possible to have dual diagnoses. And you can possibly develop PTSD. I never say that you will, because again, people, their recovery rates are different. Your amount of resilience is different. And if you have a loving community around you that will support and just be there for you, you can bounce back a lot easier, as opposed to someone that, you had this traumatic event happen and then you had zero support from your family or community and you're on your own, then you're likely more susceptible to developing PTSD.
Okay. Thanks, Jorge. Do you have anything else you want to add, or do you think we covered it all?
No, I think we covered it all. The only thing I'll say is that if you are out there and you feel that you yourself are dealing with PTSD-like symptoms, or whether it's just trauma and you don't know what to call it, or if you have a loved one that you see is suffering in some kind of way, the resources are out there. Even if you're not ready to make an appointment with, clinicians like myself, hopefully, we love doing these videos because we love to show the community, therapy is not scary. We're people just like you. We look like you. We don't use really super technical language. We try to make it as digestible as possible. But definitely, look up the National Center for PTSD. It's actually part of the VA, and they have great information and pamphlets that you can look at, either if you're suffering from PTSD or if you have a loved one that's suffering from PTSD. And whenever you're ready, reach out to a place like Family Houston, and we have therapists that can help you.
Awesome. So I just want to put out real quick, I know you kind of talked, many veterans or people who have been in combat, could experience PTSD or most likely have been through a traumatic event or potentially have been. Family Houston, we offer not only right now, thanks to a Bob Woodruff and
the Harvey Cutter Fund.
Yes.
Cutter, yes.
We're able to offer counseling at no cost to those veterans who are seeking treatment. But we also we offer financial assistance and case management services for veterans and their families. So if you know someone who's a veteran and is struggling, or you are, please contact us. We can help you. That's what we're here for. We're here to help the community. And Jorge, you almost got out of here, but I have one more question that just came through. Can you give an example of having PTSD without a traumatic event, other than someone who's predisposed, or other than work, like a first responder?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So sometimes people do have a confusion as to, how can I have PTSD if I feel like nothing's happened to me? So what typically happens is we have the person come into the office and we talk to them, and they often will not claim that they have PTSD, but they'll be reporting symptoms. And obviously, like, our little therapeutic, ears go off and we start assessing and everything. And then we start diving into their history. And then what typically happens is we realize that even though you may not view something as traumatic, either because you're downplaying it or you don't feel that it was trauma, when you really look at it, we've had situations where we talk to people and it's like, oh, you could have died. It's not that maybe you were attacked by someone, but you were in a life or death situation, but because you normalized it, or because maybe the person doesn't want to admit that it was that bad, because they don't want to be looked at like they're complaining or something like that, then we begin to realize like there is a trauma narrative there. Or if it's something that happened so long ago, like we've had people that they said, this happened when I was 10 years old, so why should it bother me now if I'm in my 60s or whatever it may be? So again, we see a lot of people watering it down, but once we talk to them and we realize, oh, there actually is traumatic events here. So we do our best to educate them of, well, let's look at this event. How did it really impact your life? And typically they come to understand, oh, this was bigger than what I thought.
I think that's a good point. I think I've been around people who are close to me, over my life. And I think some people friends and things have gone through something like that. And I think it's, they don't want to be viewed like that, or they don't personally think it's that bad, or someone else had it worse. And I think so many times people don't, just because someone else has it worse doesn't mean what you went through is any less traumatic or difficult.
Exactly.
Okay. Sorry, Jorge. We have another question that just came through.
Okay.
Besides PTSD, what else can you target with CPT?
So the thing about cognitive processing therapy is that it is specifically a PTSD-oriented treatment. So CPT, people may be confusing it with cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's CBT. So with cognitive behavioral therapy, you can apply that to a lot of other different diagnoses. But cognitive processing therapy, it is a research-based modality that is 100% committed to tackling post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's the difference, is that some people may say, oh, it only targets PTSD, but no, but the issue is that we need something that is so specified to target this, because again, PTSD is that disorder of non-recovery that people have so many symptoms of avoidance. So it's really targeted for that population.
Okay, awesome. That's very helpful. Maybe I'll have to have you back when we can talk about maybe CBT and some other types of therapy that people could look into for other things they might be dealing with in life. So Jorge, thank you again for taking the time to talk to us today. I think this is a very helpful and informative topic that affects a lot of people and people may not know about. So thank you again. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back again soon with more informative topics. And again, if you would like to make an appointment with a Family Houston clinician such as Jorge, or a case manager or financial coach, we're here, and all you have to do is call 713-861-4849. Thank you, guys.